He was pinned to the wall, the cold knife pressed to his mouth, as the thug pointed the knife at him, warning him about his actions. The thugs tied both of them to chairs in the garage, doused them with gasoline, and prepared for a brutal act. As the couple groaned in pain, the thugs set the fire, burning them alive right there in the dark garage. The film opens with a scene of an airplane landing on the runway, setting a promising atmosphere. The camera then shifts to the interior of a car, where Jimmy Vickers, a special interrogation officer, is listening to an old voicemail. A warm voice, seemingly his mother's, plays, expressing her longing to see her son again soon and hoping for his safe return. The man looked deeply troubled as he returned home, seemingly carrying the weight of a tragedy. Upon entering the house, he listened to a voicemail from Griffin, a close friend, offering words of comfort and sympathy for the loss he was enduring. Clearly, some tragedy had occurred and Jimmy couldn't hide his profound pain. Later he sought refuge in a small bar, owned by Debs and Terry. Jimmy straightforwardly asked if they knew anything about the incident, but Terry firmly denied it. But undeterred, Jimmy pointed out that Terry had been near his parents' house, less than 50 yards away, close enough to hear the screams on that fateful night. Feeling cornered, Terry grew uncomfortable and coldly told Jimmy to leave if he was only there to stir trouble. In a hint of desperation and anger over what was happening, Jimmy lost control, grabbing Terry by the collar, escalating the tension and leading to a brawl with a stranger. Debs quickly intervened, stopping Jimmy and urging Terry to reveal what he knew. Eventually, Terry had no choice but to confess. He explained that on that fateful night, he had called the fire department after witnessing 4 members of a gang break into the house. Terry clearly heard Jimmy's father's agonizing screams, but was too terrified to intervene, standing frozen at the window. The plot gradually unfolds, and we see Jimmy standing motionless in the charred garage of the house, where his parents were believed to have been murdered. He surveys the area, feeling the weight of past pain flood back as his gaze lingers on an old photo of his parents he found in the room. The scene then rewinds a few days, taking the audience back to when Jimmy's parents were still alive, and the house was still filled with warmth and laughter. Jimmy's mother eagerly prepares for the day her son returns, asking her husband, George, to mow the lawn so the yard looks neater and cleaner. Both of them are excitedly looking forward to Jimmy's return, and George agrees to do it as soon as he gets back home. Meanwhile, 4 members of a gang sit in a car, high on illegal drugs, waiting for their next target. One of them confidently states that the target will be withdrawing money as usual. The scene shifts to a girl leaving a building, preparing to deposit money at the bank. The thugs, wearing rabbit masks to conceal their identities, immediately begin following her car. Eventually, block her at the end of the street and pull her out of the car, causing her to panic. One member of the gang rummages through the car looking for money but finds nothing. Suddenly George, Jimmy's father, happens to drive by and stops right at the scene. Noticing his presence, the thugs immediately demand that George leave. However, one of them unexpectedly attacks him with a baseball bat. Despite this, George refuses to back down. He quickly retaliates, delivering a powerful punch that knocks out the attacker, then smashing his head during the scuffle. George continues to face the remaining thugs, firmly demanding that they leave the scene. One of them recklessly pulls out a knife, pointing it directly at him as a threat. But at the sound of distant police sirens, the gang panics and flees. Soon after, the police arrive at the scene. In his statement, George calmly explains that he only wanted to prevent the situation from escalating and had no intention of causing any harm. Chief Inspector Holland sarcastically remarked, "You should have thought about that before swinging the baseball bat without delay." He ordered George's arrest on charges of manslaughter. Later that day, the remaining 3 thugs went to their boss, Warren, to report the failed heist. Upon hearing that the robbery didn't go as planned, Warren seemed frustrated. However, the biggest shock came when he learned that his brother had been killed in the incident. Furious over his brother's death, Warren coldly ordered his thugs, "Don't come back here until George is no longer alive." After George was released on bail and returned home, the gang, now including Warren, secretly followed him. They split into 2 groups. 2 of them went to the front door and knocked, while the others quietly circled around to the back of the house, preparing for their next move. One of the gang members threatened to attack George's mother. George was pinned against the wall, a cold knife pressed to his mouth, and the thug pointed the knife at him, warning that he shouldn't act like a hero that day. They then tied George and his mother to chairs in the garage, poured gasoline over them, and prepared for a brutal act. As the couple painfully groaned, Warren set the fire, burning them alive in the dark garage. The scene quickly shifts to the present, where Jimmy stands amidst the wreckage of that very garage. His police friend, Griffin, informs him that one of the neighbors saw a black BMW speeding by around 11 p.m. that night. However, they didn't manage to catch the license plate number. Griff suspected that the gang involved in the conflict with George could be the ones responsible for his death, but the police lacked enough evidence to charge them. After instructing Griff to send in the CCTV footage of the robbery, Jimmy left the garage with tears in his eyes. The next morning, he visited his parents' grave and quietly lit an incense stick in their memory. As Jimmy stood in the church, his wife, Morgan, unexpectedly appeared. It was here that we learned that before the tragedy, Morgan and Jimmy were on the verge of divorce. Morgan admitted that he had missed the funeral, even though she had sent him letters 5 times. However, realizing that Jimmy was going through a tough time, she gently comforted him, telling him that he wasn't alone and that he could visit her apartment anytime. The next day, Griff arranged a meeting with Jimmy and revealed that the black BMW belonged to Warren, whose brother, the accidental victim killed by George that day, was identified through the investigation. Griff then handed Jimmy the CCTV footage from the robbery. That night, as Warren was leaving the gym, a car suddenly sped up and crashed into him from behind. Warren got out of the car, only to find Jimmy waiting in the car behind him. As he started ranting and insulting, he didn't realize he had mistaken the person. As a special forces officer, Jimmy quickly subdued Warren and knocked him out. When Warren regained consciousness, he found himself tied to the front seat, with the car reeking of gasoline as Jimmy had doused the entire area with fuel. Jimmy reminded Warren of the couple he had killed 2 weeks earlier, which caused Warren to explode in anger, declaring that he had acted correctly. Instead of feeling remorse, Warren calmly told Jimmy about the night he had attacked Jimmy's mother. Keeping his composure, Jimmy demanded that Warren name the members of his gang, promising to let him go if he cooperated. After Warren revealed the names of the gang members, Jimmy lit a cigarette.
Let me go!
Then walked out to meet Morgan. However, he couldn't stay long due to his knife wound. When Jimmy stood up, Morgan sensed something was wrong. Seeing the blood seeping through his shirt, she immediately brought him inside and tended to his injury. Despite being on the verge of divorce, the incident brought them closer together, and in the end, Jimmy decided to stay the night at Morgan's place. The next day, Warren's death made headlines, but everyone knew about his past with drug dealing and his criminal record. When Rob, one of the thugs, heard about the accident, he and Leon immediately went to Warren's business partner, Caleb, whom they suspected might have killed Warren over a dispute related to percentages. The duo arrived at Caleb's house and confronted him, but Caleb appeared confused, insisting that he knew nothing about the incident. After being saved by his girlfriend, Caleb denied all accusations and threatened Rob and Leon not to return to his neighborhood. At night, Griff visited Jimmy and advised him not to seek revenge on the criminals himself. However, contrary to Griff's advice, Jimmy believed that the corrupt legal system would never stop the thugs who were negatively impacting most families in the town. They just took statements and processed the case while the perpetrator mocked them and spat in their faces. Later, Griff arrived at the crime scene, where a man had been killed in an armed robbery. Here, Griff began to notice flaws within the police department as Chief Inspector Holland ignored the robbery and the victims, even openly stating that the store owner shouldn't seek revenge. When Griff expressed his anger and emphasized that the man was just defending his livelihood, Holland casually told him to take a sedative. According to Holland, the victim's wife would receive a large insurance payout, along with compensation, and everything would end smoothly. Meanwhile, Jimmy continued his hunt, targeting the next gang member, Ryan. He took Ryan to a remote location, tied him to a chair and gagged him. Knowing all the methods of torture that special investigators could use, Jimmy was determined to seek revenge. Jimmy poured cement into Ryan's mouth, causing him to swallow and suffocate to death. The next day, the police discovered Ryan's body, frozen from head to stomach by the cement. DCI Holland appeared very interested in the case, seeing it as an opportunity for a promotion. Later, Terry, the bar owner, gave Holland the CCTV footage from his bar, showing Jimmy dragging an unconscious man into his car. Although Debs advised Terry not to reveal the video, he didn't want his bar to suffer the same fate as George's house. The police questioned Morgan about Jimmy, and she lied, claiming that Jimmy was hiding in her apartment. Later, Jimmy appeared in a supermarket, where 2 officers began to follow him. As they were about to arrest him, a car suddenly stopped. 2 burly men stepped out and attacked the officers, giving Jimmy the chance to escape with them. Jimmy was surprised to see Colonel Leach step out of the car. Since Jimmy was an important asset to the Special Forces, it was the Colonel himself who had come to bring him back. He gave Jimmy an additional 48 hours to wrap up his business, implying settling matters with the remaining gang members before he had to return to duty. Griff approached his colleague Joe, the SWAT team leader, and warned him that the case should not be taken too seriously. Suspecting something was amiss, Joe asked if Griff knew the killer. Griff then revealed the truth that he was a friend of Jimmy, whose parents had been brutally murdered. When Joe still believed that Jimmy had lost control, Griff bluntly stated that Holland was no different, and that he was only interested in the case due to his ambition to become the director, which could ultimately ruin the police department with his corruption and negligence. With the support of the military, Jimmy began executing his plan for revenge, knowing he couldn't be caught. While Leon was sitting in a strip club, he received an envelope containing photos of Ryan's dead body. Sensing danger, Leon hurriedly left the club and fled, but was soon knocked down by Jimmy. When he regained consciousness, Leon realized he was tightly bound to the ground, with his lower body chained to a gate and his upper body tied to a car. Leon didn't understand why he was being tortured, which only made Jimmy angrier. Without an ounce of mercy, Jimmy got in the car and sped off at full throttle, tearing Leon's body apart. The next morning, Colonel Leach ran into D.C. Holland at a restaurant. He demanded that Holland hand over all the information the police had on Jimmy, while stating that Jimmy belonged to the military, not under his jurisdiction. He admitted, people like Jimmy don't fear death but rather welcome it. In the end, he warned that Jimmy would destroy all of them and disappear without a trace. DCI Holland, despite fully understanding the danger, accepted the challenge and declared that he would hunt Jimmy down to the end. Before leaving, the colonel warned Holland that if he touched Jimmy he would face severe consequences. Next, the police chief and the military commander met for a brief discussion. The military commander got straight to the point, asserting that Jimmy, who was the target of the investigation, could not be arrested under any circumstances. Officials did not reveal much about Jimmy, but they informed the directors that he was a key asset to the UK's top secret intelligence agencies. The military hierarchy required senior levels of the police to report directly on the progress of the investigation. That night, Rob, the last member of the gang who killed Jimmy's parents, was taken outside by a drug cartel. Jimmy forced Rob to knock on the door and used him as a human shield. However, Rob later managed to escape the scene. Jimmy eliminated all the remaining members of the drug cartel, except for Caleb, Warren's business partner. He then tied Caleb to a chair and mixed chemicals in a bucket, substances commonly used by drug dealers to process drugs. Holland seemed undeterred by the pursuit of Jimmy and decided to defy the director's orders. He then continued to chase the last remaining gang member, who had escaped the scene the night before and was receiving treatment at the hospital. The injured man was in Jimmy's apartment, rummaging through some letters. Shortly after, Jimmy caught up with him and forced him to drive near the harbor. Jimmy forced the man to sit down, kneel with his hands tied, and then pulled out a syringe, declaring that it contained an extremely dangerous gas that could incinerate anyone exposed to it. In response, Rob spat in Jimmy's face and told him to look in the trunk of the car. What shocked Jimmy was that Rob had killed Morgan before he could finish him off. In disbelief and exhaustion, Jimmy didn't hesitate to unload the entire magazine into Rob. Just as the SWAT team led by Holland arrived at the scene, Griff was also present and confronted Holland about allowing Rob to leave the hospital, which helped him kill Jimmy's wife. Holland explained that he had let Rob go in order to track down Jimmy, but he had no idea Rob would go on to kill Morgan. Realizing the truth about Holland, SWAT team leader Joe ordered the team to stop catching Holland off guard. They allowed Jimmy, despite his injury, to leave the scene, while Holland tried to stop him. Before leaving, Jimmy punched Holland in the face, forcing him to halt. The film ends in an alley where a girl accidentally drops some trash. Two strangers block her, grab her, and she screams for help. From the end of the alley, Jimmy appears. The thugs face him and demand that he leave, and the screen slowly fades to black, leaving only Jimmy's cold smile.